Okay, guys. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about um, lexical borrowing between languages, and also the impact of that on morphology. Now, I'm going to talk about borrowing more generally in the first part of the video, and then the second part of the video, I'm going to focus more on Greek, and how that affects the morphology of English. Okay, cool. So let's begin. For example, if you say ojalá in Spanish or almohada in Spanish or alcázar in Spanish, does that make you a speaker of Arabic? Well, I would say it doesn't. I would say that these are examples of loan words, words that were originally Arabic, and have come into Spanish via Arabic. It's like this is what we call a linguistic borrowing. Okay. Now, these words can change their pronunciation, and in some cases, they can kind of change their meaning slightly. So, I've got a very good friend of mine who studied Arabic at SOAS. SOAS is the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and he very generously recorded these three words in Arabic, in their original Arabic pronunciation for us to listen to. So,
إن شاء الله. المحدى. القصر.
okay, so I hope you could hear what he was saying. Um, probably the biggest change that we can notice is ojalá and coming from inshallah. I mean, obviously my pronunciation is nowhere near as good as Elliot's. Now, the reason why that's so interesting is because you guys know that Allah is the God, the Muslim God, right? So it means if God is willing. So when we say ojalá, pues you all know what it means. I mean, maybe it's not kind of quite so tied to religion as it is in the Arabic sense. However, if you listen to Almohada and Alcázar, you can kind of see or you can hear that they're kind of very similar in pronunciation. Let me play it one more time.
المحدى. القصر.
So in those two cases, guys, there's not much of a difference really. I mean, they seem quite similar to me. And I asked him about the meaning of them as well, and he says, yeah, pretty much. I mean, like, these last two haven't really undergone any sort of semantic shift. They mean the same, and the pronunciation to me seems pretty similar. Ojalá, on the other hand, seems a little bit different. So, if you say ojalá, if you say almohada, if you say alcázar, does that make you a speaker of Arabic? I wouldn't say so. Okay, now let's move on to some borrowings from English into Spanish. Okay, so we've got the word chat. For example, I mean, I've spoken to people who don't speak any English or have a very, very limited command of English. And they say, pues te lo dije en el chat. No me llegó nada, no he visto el chat en varios días. Or, for example, nice. You know, this is kind of linked to social class as well, right? Ay, Dios mío, qué nice. I've spoken to people with a very, very limited knowledge of English who use that word. And there are hundreds and thousands, maybe even millions of people around the world who have very, very little knowledge of English. And they use the word internet or internet. Now, obviously, when I say internet or internet, the pronunciation is very slightly different. But, you know, nothing kind of drastic, right? Um, the interesting thing about this one is if you notice, this word in English has actually got two morphemes, internet. Whereas in Spanish, internet, why do we not call it interred? Because, you know, the net is red, right? But anyway, so in Spanish it's just one morpheme, but in English it's two. Okay, these are what we call, guys, loan words. All right. Loan words are the product of a linguistic concept called borrowing. Now, I remember when I studied historical linguistics at university, my teachers told me that using the word borrowing to talk about this linguistic concept is a bit of a misnomer like a poorly used word, because when you borrow something, it gives you the idea that you're going to give it back. For example, oh, can I borrow your book? Can I borrow 50 pesos? Can I borrow whatever? It doesn't mean you're going to give it back to that person. Usually, when we say it means you're going to give it back to that person. But in linguistics, it's not like, a ver, inglés, présteme selfie en lo que en español creamos nuestra propia palabra. Obviously, that's not the idea. For example, the La RAE would like us to use autofoto, right? But nobody uses that in Mexico, as far as I know. So the idea of borrowing the word to give it back in the future is not the case. Okay, now when Brexit happened in the UK, there was a petition. The UK government, many people signed this petition to remove the French from our passports because now we're out of the EU, we don't need the French and blah 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 blah. So if you look at a British passport, like mine, you can see that we've got some words. Well, that's the same, right? I'm not sure about the pronunciation. I don't speak French. But look, prénom and given names and nationalité and I'm sorry to anybody who speaks French about my pronunciation of these words, but that's what they were protesting about. And they were saying, because we're leaving the EU, we also want to get rid of these elements on our passports, right? Well, here's the petition they wrote. They wrote, petitions, UK government and parliament. The petition is to remove French words from British passports, and it consists of almost entirely French words or words of French and Norman origin. So we've got remove and cover and passports. Mottos, that's an Italian word. Language existed. So the petition that they've written has lots of words in French, or lots of words that were originally French words. Signatures, for example, sign, petition, and they've been highlighted, right? So kind of ironic that they've written a petition using lots of words that were originally French. Now, this kind of gives you a very interesting look at the way borrowing works in language. For example, if you look at you can see that these people don't consider the word government or parliament to be a French word. They say, no, that's an English word. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using, what they consider to be French words in a petition to remove French words from British passports, right? So you can see like the way language is organized in the mind kind of says once these borrowings have kind of been, I don't know what the word would be, like really cemented into the language, we then stop considering them as borrowings. For example, I mean, right now we can easily identify selfie as a linguistic borrowing, or I don't know, nice or chat or lipstick or outfit. We can easily identify those as linguistic borrowings, but maybe in generations to come, those words will become very embedded in the Spanish language. So, for example, a few years ago, one of my nieces asked me, Dan, how do you say bye in English? I was like, well, bye is actually an English word, like bye, ahí nos vemos, and I was like, well, bye is actually an English word. He goes, oh no, I thought it was a Spanish word. Well, yeah, okay, it is Spanish now, but it was originally English. In fact, when we say bye in English, we say bye. Like, oh, I thought that was Spanish. So that was a really interesting example. She was using a word, a linguistic borrowing, but had no idea that it was a linguistic borrowing. And I think that's kind of like the point that I'm making here. If you look, all of these words are linguistic borrowings, but people don't see them as linguistic borrowings, okay? Because, they've been in the part of the language for such a long time. So, Kenya posted about Greek. So, why do we have Greek words in English? Now, when you study historical linguistics, you also need to study history, because, language as a social phenomenon is linked to history. So, for example, what happened first? Well, we had the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC before Christ, and if we look at my map here, we can see this is Rome, right? And then they went long here, and then they went all the way to Corinth, and the Roman Empire expanded into Greek. So it says here, I took this from the internet. From this point on, Greece was ruled by Rome, so it was part of the Roman Empire. Despite being ruled by Rome, much of the Greek culture remained the same and had a heavy influence on Roman culture. Now, that is the beginning of Greek's journey, or ancient Greek's journey, of linguistic influence on the English language. So, because when the Roman Empire arrived, they didn't just completely decimate ancient Greek culture. Lots of concepts and lots of ideas, and therefore lots of linguistic influence um, came from Greek, ancient Greek, into Latin. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. Um, what does this have to do with English? Why are you talking about Greek? Why are you talking about Latin? Well, what happened next was, in this kind of very basic version of the story, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 1476. Now, all of these territories, you can't see them on this map, but what we know as modern day France, modern day Spain, modern day Portugal. At this time in history, they were all speaking Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin, like the commoners' Latin, not the classical Latin of authors. Okay. So this led to the birth of the Romance languages. So we're talking Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, etc., etc., etc. So what does this have to do with English? Well, in 1066, the Battle of Hastings happened. And if we look at a map of Hastings, you can see that Hastings is in the very, very, very south of the British Isles. So therefore very vulnerable to attack from France. Now, there was a guy called William the Conqueror, and he came from France and conquered pretty much all of this area. But again, he didn't completely decimate the people. The common people at this time in the history of England were speaking a language called Anglo-Saxon. Okay, so how did Greek get into English? Well, first, ancient Greek got into Latin. Then Latin gave birth to what was at that time in 1066 Old French. And then Old French came to England in 1066 and became what we would call in linguistics the Superstrate Language. So let me just write that for you. Superstrate Language. And the language of the common people, the people who were working like common jobs, like the blue collar section of society, they were speaking the substrate. Now, and the substrate was Anglo-Saxon. So if people wanted to kind of sound fancy and like more sophisticated, they would use French vocabulary. Now, at that time, Old French was very, very, very similar to Latin because Latin had just kind of stopped existing, or had kind of like, that's pretty much in linguistics where we call an end to Latin and start a beginning with Old French or Old Spanish or Old Portuguese or Old Romanian, whatever it might be. Okay, so that's pretty much how Greek got into English. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, what happens when we're talking about Greek words which have come into English via Latin and via Old French, and therefore have kind of survived to today? Think about the word stadium, or stadiums, or stadia. Now, these words were originally Greek, and the Latin plural of stadium was stadia. Now, honestly, I have never in my life, other than the study of linguistics, ever used the word stadia. It's always stadiums. So, for example, while I was in England, I visited 5 stadiums. I would never say, while I was in England, I visited 5 stadia. So, what you can see here in terms of morphology is that we've made this word singular. This word is singular, and we make it plural using English morphology. Now, even though it's not originally an English word. Okay, but what that's kind of showing you is that it's accepted into the English vocabulary, and therefore is treated, morphologically speaking, as if it were an English word, which I find personally amazing. But here's the thing, we've got an example of lexical shift. The word stadium comes from Greek, stadion, don't ask me to pronounce this, I don't know how, a measure of length equaling approximately 200 meters. Now, when we talk about a stadium nowadays, we don't talk about approximately 200 meters. We talk about, La Bombonera or, Foro Sol, whatever it might be. Now, here's the weird thing. We've got other words which were originally Greek, right? Now, depending on the kind of how familiar you are, or if you had like a classical education, that's going to determine which form of the word you use. So look at this, octopus. Octopus originally comes from ancient Greek. So octo, it means 8, and pies, pues, ocho pies, pues. So wouldn't the plural be octopodes? If when you've got a problem with your feet, you go to the podologo, or a podologist. So octopuses is also accepted in this dictionary, or at least in the Microsoft Word dictionary. But what about octopi? Octopi. That's also accepted. So you can see that we've actually got. Octopodes, I think nowadays doesn't so much refer to having more than one octopus. It refers more to the fact that it's an 8-footed creature of some sort. Whether it be a spider or whatever. But what about octopi? Now, the amazing thing is, in my personal and biased opinion, is that octopi is actually Latin morphology. It's Latin morphology applied to a Greek or an ancient Greek word. And some people, some prescriptivists of the English language, would flinch at the idea of somebody saying octopuses. No, how could it be octopuses? It's octopi. All right. The same is true of hippopotamus. Again, this actually is a compound word, not in English. It's not. It's just like the case with internet. Internet is a compound word in English, but it's not in Spanish. Hippopotamus is not a compound word in English, but originally it actually meant horse river. So the horse of the river, el caballo del río, no? Which, with a bit of imagination, you can kind of understand why they would call a hippopotamus a horse river, or a river horse, I should say, which I find very interesting. Now, again, the Latin morphology of this Greek word would be hippopotami. But what do we say? Most people, 99% of people in English say hippopotamuses. We went on safari and we saw many hippopotamuses. That's fine. However, if you're familiar with a little bit of Latin, you would probably say hippopotami, because it's considered more correct and blah blah. But it's ironic. Any prescriptivist would say, "Oh, you can't say hippopotamuses; it's hippopotami." They're kind of prescribing Latin morphology for ancient Greek vocabulary in the English language. So these concepts, in my opinion, are amazingly interesting. Think about this one: medium, media, and medias. So, for example, I was doing this proof editing work recently about social media, and when I talk about social media, I use it as its plural, right? So social media are one of the most important concepts in modern society, or whatever it might be, because media is plural. But honestly, I admit I'm the minority of English speakers in that case, because most people say, "Oh, social media is changing the world." And I'm not a prescriptivist, but any prescriptivist would say, "Hold on, social media is? No, social media are. Don't you know that media is plural? It's the plural form of medium from Latin, which is kind of weird because we're applying Latin morphology to ancient Greek vocabulary and saying that's the correct usage in English, which kind of seems a bit crazy to me. But that's the way linguistics is. But you notice here, medias is also accepted by this dictionary. The reason I left this in, at least here, I left it in the United States dictionary version, is because I want you to see that I haven't just turned off corrections. Like it's saying that meters is wrong because of the British spelling, okay? But this would be wrong in any. If you want, I can change it into the United States, and you can see that it's accepting everything. It's accepting both forms. So again, let's have a look at this one. Syllabus. Yeah? Syllabus is a Greek word which came into Latin, and the Latin plural was syllabi. But it also accepts syllabuses. For example, "Oh, I need to design the syllabuses." I don't think I'd ever say, "Oh, I need to design the syllabi." Cactus, cacti. Again, it's a Greek word, or it was originally a Greek word, but we can apply either Latin morphology to make the plural, cacti, or we can apply English morphology or English morphological rules to make the plural form, so cactuses, right? Now, these two are really interesting examples. I use the Oxford English Word Corpus dictionary to find this information. Now, when we talk about nucleus, like the nucleus of a cell, I'm sure you'll agree with me that these are usually used in more formal texts and kind of like more official documents, and therefore the people that write them are likely to have more familiarity with classical languages. Just as a social point, in the UK, if you study Latin or ancient Greek at school, it's because you went to a really expensive private school. If you, it would be very, very unusual for me to hear of a case of somebody who studied Latin or ancient Greek during their school life, but went to a public school. Those concepts are just those topics are just not taught at public schools in the UK. By public school, I mean state school. Okay. Um, Now, the most common form is nuclei. Nucleuses is acceptable, but nuclei is more common because if you think about like the social circumstances in which one uses these words, and also the people who write about nucleus or nuclei know that their readers are likely to have some sort of familiarity with the with classical languages, right? So therefore, they think that nucleus should be nuclei and not nucleuses, applying English morphology. But again, guys, this is Greek. This is this language. This word was originally Greek. So why do we think that Latin morphology for Greek words is more correct than English morphology for Greek words or for originally Greek words? And the same is true of fungus. If you think about doctors, usually they're the ones that you're going to speak to when you're talking about a fungus or how many fungi have you been infected by or whatever. Um, you know, Again, this is the singular form, and funguses is accepted. Okay. Well, guys, I hope this information is useful. I hope it, helps you get a bit of an appreciation of the connection between different areas of linguistics. So, I mean, here we're talking about morphology, we're talking about etymology, and we're also talking about historical linguistics. Now, remember, when you study historical linguistics, you also need to study history in itself because you need to know the ways in which these different languages throughout history have influenced each other. Okay, well, I hope this information helps, guys, and have a lovely day.